Okay, we're here for a fantastic panel. Some of these people have spoken through the day, but I think we want to hear a bit more. First off, we're going to have Seema Lakhani, Head of Product at Wattpad. Gibson, but his mother calls him that, so Gib Biddle, former VP of Product at Netflix. Jenna Bastow, co-founder of ProdPad. Jenna, have you run out of those fantastic books already?
But I'm happy to send them to anybody who emails me.
Okay, they looked fantastic. Okay. And then let's welcome to the stage for the first time Amar Varma, the co-founder and COO of Autonomic. Hi, Amar. And our moderator, Damian McCabe, the co-founder and VP Engineering here at Connected.
Awesome, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be ending the day with a nice interactive panel. So we will open up for questions afterwards, but we'll have a little bit of dialogue beforehand. So if you've got questions, hold on to them, keep them ready for the end, and we'll definitely try to make sure that we get to them. First off, I mean, what an amazing day. I've been here watching all the presentations today, and it's been a full house in here the entire day, which is really awesome. So thank you all for coming out to Elevate Product here at Connected. It's awesome. Thank you. So the goal for this panel is to really talk about the challenges of moving from having a product vision through to actually executing and delivering a product. And so that's really what we're going to focus on talking about. That is a big topic. It encompasses people and product, tactics and metrics and tools and all kinds of different things. So we'll try to touch on a bunch of that stuff, again, really with the focus on that huge challenge of moving from vision to execution. And so with that, I want to start pretty straightforward, but just to level set around vision. What is product vision? Why is it important? Anyone can take it. The most eager panelist.
I'm happy to start with that because I literally had a slide about vision on my deck. So the product vision is that guiding light that inspires people to want to work on this product. What is it that you're going to do and affect? Now, it doesn't necessarily mean something that, it doesn't have to be like a feature or something like that you're going to achieve in the next year. This is like what you're going to change in the company, in the world. What is your mark going to be when people look back and say, oh yeah, that thing that existed in the noughties or the whatever years, that's what it was doing. And so it should be something broad-reaching, something that extends 10 years beyond what you think you can do, and should have an impact on the world itself.
I mean, it sounds like such a vague thing and a big thing. I'm quite curious, how does a vision get created, and who's involved in that process? Is it defined, or is it more organic?
I mean, typically it's founder level. It's the people who've put the energy into why are we here? Why are we building this product? Why do we, why does any of it matter? So typically it's founder level. It can change, and sometimes isn't always, but I see that's probably the most common is its founding team that's really got to establish why their company, their product should bother to exist in this universe and what difference it's going to make. In terms of living it day to day post sort of the initial founding, it's got to be top, like it's got to be right from the top in terms of like continuing to reinforce why it matters. If there is ever an iteration on it, that's got to be something that's so intrinsic to sort of the most sort of heart of the company ultimately.
Great. I'm curious, like, what does it look like? Is it a document? Like, is it a PowerPoint deck? Like, what? How does it live? How does a vision live?
I'll try. So let's see, I'll do Chegg. Chegg is the textbook rental company. The mission, our purpose was to help students save time, save money, get smarter. Our vision, I sort of used this model already. It was a little bit of a route on how you get there. So at Chegg, the idea is we get big on textbooks by mail. Step 2 was to lead essentially homework help services. And step 3 was expand into multiple services via a student graph, essentially. And so it's sort of, there's the purpose and then sort of kind of a vague route or a route of how you'll get there. And then it dives into the strategy. And I gave you examples of different strategies from Netflix and the metrics and the tactics. The controversial thing, if I can't remember something, it's not that helpful. And you know, we're all leaders, and our job is to provide an inspired communication of the future. And so it's hard for me to have both a mission and a vision and the strategies. It just becomes kind of mumbo for me. So I just try to keep it simple wherever I can.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The vision should be something that's written in simple enough language that anybody in your team is able to reiterate it and talk about it as you need to. It reminds me of a company that I worked for that had not a particularly well-defined vision, and this became painfully clear at a recruitment conference, trade show that we were at. This is going back a couple companies now, and there was about 15 of us there trying to recruit people into our team, and somebody went around to each person and said, so, what are you guys trying to do? And each person gave him a different answer, and he came to me on the stand and said, so everyone's given me a different answer. What do you do? And I think that's when I realized how important it was to have a solid vision that everyone could get behind and know what they're doing. But yeah, it can change over time. A small company will tend to have a shorter term vision than companies who aspire to be here in 100 years from now. And there are companies who explicitly make that their goal is to be here 100 years from now. What are they trying to do over the course of that time? That's part of their vision.
Right, got it. That makes sense. You mentioned that it will change and update and evolve. I'm curious, how do you know how do you make sure that the vision is clear enough so that it can guide execution and yet not so rigid or defined that people don't feel like they can challenge it and morph it?
My take on that is that it's not necessarily the vision that defines the execution. There's a layer in between that, which is it should be defining how you're measuring your objectives. Everybody here heard of OKRs? Or some variation of basically setting these high-level objectives, saying, in order to reach this overall goal, what are you measuring? How do you know you're actually making that impact? And those things allow you to set more concrete goals that people can get behind. Because if your vision is to, change the way people buy textbooks, it's so broad, there's so many ways of doing that. But if you say, actually, our strategy along the way is to do X, Y, and Z, and so for the next year, our plan is to get from here to here, that's something you can measure on and execute on. And that makes a big difference for companies.
I can do sort of story of transition. So at Netflix, we debated whether our mission was to connect people with movies they love or to democratize movie creation. And that was a debate for probably a year. And then looking back on it, I'm like, that was stupid. At the end of the day, Netflix, that's what it is. What it is today is it's about entertainment. Like, I can remember that. And it's trying to be much bigger than Disney in the next 50 years. I mean, the last 50 years, Disney owned entertainment. Everybody in the building understands that.
Yeah. And
it's very inspiring. Which that's my real test for the vision. There's a juicy quote, the Le Petit Prince person. If you want to build a ship, don't just gather wood, divide and conquer. Teach everyone to yearn for the vast and endless sea. And that's really what you're trying to accomplish with some of these ideas. I could do the French version very badly after beers.
And that quote actually lives at the very top of Netflix's culture document, if I recall.
Yep.
And that was actually something that really changed my thinking in terms of what is a good culture. It's certainly not foosball tables. I mean, they're great, they're useful, but it is something that people can yearn for, something that people can actually want to get involved and build for and help change the world around, even if it is, the ends is creating entertainment.
I'll just chime in real quick. So to me, there's always like a litmus test. Can you show up at Thanksgiving or holidays and explain to others what you're doing? And if you can't, you don't have it right. I don't care how complicated your thing is. If you can't explain it to people you interact with all the time, forget it. You got to keep working on it. And then kind of how to crystallize this. There's usually what we want to do, and then there's the phases to getting there, and you can call it crawl, walk, run. You can call it, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, whatever creative names you have. But you really have to kind of own that. And one of the questions is, where does it live? It lives in every conversation. So if you're, it's kind of a substrate that goes across the entire organization around, okay, we're gonna do something, and in every conversation you have, does it help accomplish that mission, right? And it goes down to all decisions.
Awesome. Catherine Ulrich this morning really focused on the importance of being really strong at execution. And I'm curious, and I'm going to force you to pick one. Is it more important to be better at execution or better at vision?
Ooh, I'm biased. Excellence in execution is a motto I've borrowed from one of my childhood heroes, Bret the Hitman Hart. To me, if you cannot execute what your grand vision is, that was always you got to be able to execute. And if you're crawling and you're executing the crawl, great. So I'm a huge believer in the execution piece.
Yeah, I'd say that's a false dichotomy. I mean, you can't have one without the other. If you're executing like mad, but you've got no vision, you end up what are you actually doing? What are you executing on? You need to have at least some of both in different measures. And each company has found their success in various ways. If you've got a really, really strong idea and strong vision, sometimes you actually luck out and you end up with companies who are making it even though they don't really deserve it. They haven't put the work in like some other companies have. Other companies don't have that strong vision. They didn't quite know where they were going, but they kept trying, and it's that execution and that ability to keep iterating that allows them to find what that vision is and figure it out.
I'll add just, while we're all working on stuff, the ideas we have we may think are novel, somebody else is also working on it. Mm-hmm. So if you're not out executing that person, you're second.
Yeah. I agree with the false dichotomy of you actually do need both at somewhere along the line. But if I absolutely had to pick gun to my head, I would probably take vision. Just because from my perspective, I do think you can get lucky on the execution. I don't think that's a good strategy, but I do think you can get lucky on the execution. I think on vision, we all are here to make the world better in some way, shape, or form, if it's for a market or group, whatever it is. If you don't have that purpose, then you can actually be doing stuff that sometimes is even dangerous. So I'd say vision if I had to pick, but I do think it's a false dichotomy. You absolutely need both.
Awesome. Seema, in your talk, you talked a little bit about how once you release a new product out into the wild, there can be unintentional product impacts. I'm curious if you get, there might be some people who weren't here, so just maybe quickly recap that, and then maybe talk about how that then affects vision and execution, those unintentional and unanticipated product impacts.
Yeah, and they're both beautiful and scary, right?
Sure.
So they can be amazing and they can be positive and they can be lots of things to learn from how people are solving different problems you hadn't anticipated, and that might shift sort of the direction you're heading in depending on where you are and the stage of your company and how big of a thing that is that's happening. It can certainly, in terms of recapping some of the stuff there, it was some of the negative consequences of that, of course, being if you put something out in the world, someone will figure out how to weaponize it. There are a lot of negative things that will naturally happen with products in terms of how you didn't intend for them to get used. And you have to be anticipating for that. You have to be, planning for that and reacting to that quickly. And so in terms of how that potentially could change vision, sometimes you might have a grand vision about, connecting the world more and all of these great things. And now suddenly there's more bullying and harassment and people feeling isolated or whatever it is that might be happening. That's something that really needs to think about. There's a double-edged sword to every element, right? Making the world more connected could also mean making the world more easy to prey on people, right? So how do you make sure that you're fulfilling the positive side of your vision, but you're also making sure that you're thinking about some of the potential negative implications and that you're working towards addressing that?
Awesome, awesome. Jenna, in your talk, you talked a lot about the challenges of managing mature products. And I think oftentimes people romanticize about new product development and they think about it in that context. I'm hoping that you can share maybe a little bit more about why is it so much harder to manage mature or declining products?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, a lot of people, as you said, they fantasize about this MVP. They idolize it, and I think that's partly because so many people have kind of talked about this early stage, this iteration, and they kind of talk about how easy it is, and it's a little bit ridiculous that we don't iterate everything every day. The reality is that most companies are not equipped to work that fast and iterate in that way, and so they've got to learn those things. It's so much easier with a small product because you don't have customers, for example. I remember in very early days of ProdPad, I could launch something on a Tuesday afternoon and no one would notice. And it means I could try things, but I didn't have the valuable feedback coming back from people, right? So, I'd rather have the customers than not.
Yeah.
And, you get things like tech debt that pile up, and then you get politics and people who already work for the company and what they think it should do as well. So all this stuff stacks up and makes it more difficult.
I'll just add, people, the shiny new ball is always fun, right? It's Imagineering at its best, right? What could be managing something that's out there, has real customers, has real dollars or something associated with it is, it's core to all the businesses. So I think it's really important that that's there, it's funded, it's supported properly. The declining one is always interesting because the companies continually create new products to kill their old products, right? So it's an interesting dynamic.
And I think the funding in VC world actually causes some of these issues to happen.
Right.
It's been argued and it's been seen time and time again. It's easier to raise for a product that has a great idea, but no actual numbers to go behind it, like pre-launch, but you've got this great idea and somebody willing to ask for the money, than it is a year after you've launched when you've actually got things to show for it, even though that product might be actually making money now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wait, I'm excited because I have another sailing metaphor.
Great.
It's like a Jeopardy column.
Sailing metaphors
Well,
200.
I was thinking about the big company challenges, and mine is, I call it big boat, small rudder. So in little startups, you jam the tiller and you turn pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Big companies, the good news is they have a ton of momentum. The bad news is they're hard to turn.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll work on the next sailing.
Excellent metaphor. Got it. No, very, very, very true. And I think some of the other things you warned about I thought were really interesting in terms of the build trap and feature factory, those kind of danger areas of once you've launched, and then you kind of just fall into this, like, because you're operating the product, I think sometimes you just get stuck in this cycle of then doing a very operational focused, like, release thing in a very, very different frame of mind than if you were doing new product development. I'm curious to hear thoughts on how you stay away from those traps when you have launched and you have a mature product and you're really trying to keep your edge.
So I'll take a first crack at this. So every good platform, product, service does one thing and one thing well, right? You can go to, whether it's entertainment, whether it's swiping right, whether it's getting a ride, pick something traditional on Vogue. Everything does one thing well, and kind of back to the substrate of the discussion internally. Every feature, every thought either needs to build on that, or if you're changing the one experience, it needs to build on the next experience, right? And generally, like, I'll use Uber Eats for example. When it came out, it was a great product I use all the time. I'm an investor, so it's probably biased. But the reality is when they started doing the Uber Eats delivery and we were doing it at work, it was great because it showed up. But then, like, the pain of putting it through the expense system and all this thing. But they went and they made a feature that said delivering meals to you is easier because it actually took care of the billing. But it wasn't in the first version. It probably wasn't even in the second version, but it showed up and it made that experience easier, right? And that's just an example, and there's thousands of them that just really worked well.
I've found a different problem, the opposite of what you described. As companies get big, they tend to lower the risk profile and they start playing it safe.
Right.
So I spent a lot of time encouraging companies to maintain the risk profile that allowed them to invent something out of nothing, the job of a startup, and just continue to bet big. So frankly, I end up celebrating a lot of mistakes and failure as just part of the natural process of invention. But it's always surprising to me. And I got no boat stuff.
And you asked, how we know to avoid it, and the reality is that, I mean, personally, the only reason I know to avoid this stuff is because I've fallen in every last one of these traps, looked behind me and went, oh yeah, I should have seen that coming because I read about somebody else talking about that, and so we find so many people fall into these traps and they end up slow. They don't even realize that they're changing the way they work once they get more customers and tech debt and other stuff. It's not like you make this switch going, okay, so we're starting to make money. We're no longer going to be nimble and lean. They go into this step accidentally and then have to figure out what they can do to claw their way back out of it. I use this analogy with somebody I was talking to after my talk today, and I like to think about the product development process as a product itself. It's something that you can measure and learn from and iterate on and improve. Don't try to just slap on some solution because your competitor's feature won't work for you. Slapping on, I don't know, Scrum isn't going to fix it, but listening and learning to how things are being built and changing the way you build stuff, whether it's trying to build a small lab and give 3 people some money to go disappear for a month and build something, or do a hackathon or whatever, these are all things you can try to improve your product development process and become more nimble and lean.
I like the risk profile you talk about, because it's here, we'll just stop there. If you're not on the edge of your seats thinking what you're doing is risky, you're at best apple polishing, and I can tell you what happens to a lot of apple polish products.
I'm tweeting that now.
Awesome. I'm curious to talk a little bit about, so we've been talking more like theoretical. I'm curious to talk a little bit about the people and the disciplines involved throughout the product development process. Amr, I know you've got a lot of experience leading technical teams, engineering teams in particular. And in some product development processes, engineers aren't really brought in until everything's figured out and we know what we're going to build, and then the engineers just need to build it and shut up. I'm curious to hear why that is, and why there's issues with that.
Oh man, we've got a lot of time for this one, but watching the clock, I'll try and synthesize it. If we were building the condo going up next door, maybe that works. And I think generally it's this whole notion of Six Sigma waterfall development that stemmed from manufacturing businesses, and then that just became the de facto process. And now you see very much an agile process in a lot of the software and services that are being built. There's no one size fits all. I started in the semiconductor chip business where we were like designing chips. That was very rigid. You were told what to do.
Yeah.
After some architect architected it. Now when you get into a lot of these products and services now, the engineers are the ones that are building them. And then people are figuring out, how do we market this thing?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's kind of almost flipping on its head. And a couple tools that I've seen along the way, anybody here a product manager? Yeah. Anybody old enough as a product manager that had to do a weekly chart deck to show status? Right? That was the colossal waste of time. Now you have tools. Atlassian has a great tool. Pivotal's got a great tool. There's a bunch of other great tools that can just fast forward you through this and kind of custom create all this update status. And it really shows that the process isn't about being gated. It's about moving forward quickly.
Yeah. Awesome. Gib, I want to ask you, and I've got a boat analogy. There are many things that can rock the boat in terms of vision and during execution. And one of those things is what competitors are doing. In your talk, you talked a lot about being customer obsessed. I know some companies and some products can kind of fall into being competitor obsessed. I'm curious, were there times that Netflix didn't remain customer obsessed and they felt like they needed to do Me Too things and be a little bit more competitor obsessed?
So it was a journey. In the early days, my team would say, hey, we should be doing what IMDb is doing. And that's a movie freak thing. And then later, when YouTube was doing original content from community-based stuff, we should be doing that. And so my short answer is we just kept saying no. And we also said no to letting people download one movie, the way Apple lets you do. We just kept saying no to all those things. And that helped us remain focused. And each year we got better at the consumer science and being obsessed. I mean, there was one other thing. Strategically, we knew that Hulu was going to be advertising model, and we knew that Apple would do a la carte. And we were just hoping that everybody would sort of stick to their lanes, which is what happened. And that was good for us. So, I mean, I've largely learned to ignore the competition. That's taken me 30 years to get to.
That's awesome. Cool. Just before we go to questions, just one kind of final thing I wanted to touch on with the panel. Each of us, especially those who have worked as advisors and consultants, have seen the inside of a lot of different product organizations. I'm curious if there are any things that kind of really changed the way that you thought about this challenge of vision to execution from that sampling that you've had inside of different types of organizations.
Well, my company was acquired by the Ford Motor Company recently, which is a 114-year-old company. They have a certain way of doing things and hitting dates and making things happen. I've learned a lot of things that don't work in context of software by watching that movie. But I've also found some things they do very well. Plug, we're going to sell 1 million F-150s this year. If you want one, come see me. We make one in 53 minutes. 53 minutes, right? Like, so they can do something pretty well.
Yeah.
So there's some learnings that I've seen in terms of the excellence in execution.
Yep.
In some of the manufacturing stuff that I'd like to bring into some of the software stuff, and in that product, the software and hardware all together in a real product.
Awesome. Gib?
For startups, it's all about try a lot of stuff as quickly as you can to learn and see what works. As you get bigger, you have to be super clear about how you make decisions, who makes decisions, to create an environment where the most talented people want to be there. And that's when really strategy takes hold. In both cases, you need to be able to execute quickly for high cadence learning. And did I mention startups are frickin' hard?
If I've learned anything, I've had the chance to work and see how thousands of different product companies work. There's more in common with them than is different. And one of the biggest things that they have in common is that they're all made up of humans, real people who have past habits and ideas and suggestions, past histories with their company. And the most important thing is to make sure that you've got this strong direction, this vision, and you give everybody the space and the permission to do their thing, do whatever works best for them, build a good culture so that people can find their own route to solving that problem. And it takes a lot of the pressure off somebody trying to dictate what needs to be executed at each step. You will find that a group of 100 humans together can build something amazing. So work with your team. Every company has a collection of humans at their disposal.
For me, it's been the art of product management or product development is so much about learning all the tools along the way. They're great. It's important to know the things like Lean and Scrum and Dual Track, and all of these things are fantastic, but they're tools and they're just tools. And at the end of the day, the art part of it, the truly hard human aspect of it is being able to know when to use what. Different companies, different environments, different cultures, different problems, all require different combination. Knowing them is really, you have to know them, because if you don't know them, you're working blind. But knowing when to throw them away, to alter them, to change things, to bring in which pieces has been, for me, an absolutely huge learning of just depends so much on your organization, the problem you're facing, the life cycle you're at, all of these different factors that come into play, and being able to sort of use your judgment, critical thinking, and that's really the tool that's most valuable is all of our own brains, and being able to pull that together and build a team that has the sharpest brains, because they're bringing all of these tools together. They're diverse, they're representing problems and people from all around the world and all of these different areas. That's when you solve the biggest, hardest problems. That's when you do the coolest work.
Awesome. Cool. With that, I want to open it up to questions in the audience. There will be a few mic runners around.
All right, thank you. I want to follow up on something Seema said this morning, and connect it to something that Alan said, and then want people to maybe answer to that. So basically, Seema said that you have to make sure to measure the right things and not necessarily profit, revenue growth, clicks, page views, this kind of stuff. So you need to measure the right metrics that are in service of the vision. And then Alan talked about the Weber barbecue company that was more, their vision is more about selling an experience. And so sometimes the vision is hard to quantify. So how do you find that metric that aligns with the vision? That's not like a purely like a click thing, or I mean, Gib was talking a lot about churn. So anyway, if you can talk about finding that metric, what is that metric? For example, at Wattpad,
It's rarely one thing. And you're right, it's super hard. Like there is rarely like this metric is perfectly aligned with like whether how far we're in achieving our vision. Some of them, there are signal metrics though that can tell you, and sort of as you've broken down vision into some of the strategic components, you can start to see these things. So for us, I mean, if people are actually reading stories and the breadth of those stories is something we can measure. And knowing that they're getting value for it based on how much they're reading and how much they're valuing is something. Now, that by itself would not be enough because we can start to head down bad paths of addictive reading or whatever, I don't know. But there's things like that, but I would say that those are the types of things we think about. Now, to just qualify, I do totally still think measuring revenue and profit and all of those are super important. It's more that only measuring those can sometimes take you down a bad track.
Yeah, I like to figure out as to whether something's a vanity metric by playing it back. So if somebody says, oh, the marketing team, their job is to get a whole bunch of leads. Well, does a whole bunch of leads help us hit our overall objective? Not necessarily. They could get us terrible leads and then blame the product team for not having a great product that kept them on board, even though they weren't the right leads. Does having a great uptime rate solve the problem? Does having a great time to resolve each bug or something like that solve the problem? Well, each of these has a piece that it plays in it, but you'll find that certain ones, if you play it back, you go, oh yeah, that if we hit that number, or if we increase that number, we will be considerably more successful. Almost every company, unless you're not for profit, does aim for revenue at some point in time or some sort of margin, so you do have to weigh it up, but you also have to weigh it up with things like the brand and the experience and things that can't be quantified, I think, as Gib was talking about in his talk.
I'll just add one quick one, and then I know time's here. I was on the board of Tinder, and I really didn't pay any attention to it till a gentleman in the corner over there showed me one day this cool thing he was using, and I was like, oh, cool. Hey, wait a minute. And then I said, so it was very interesting because then I started looking at the metrics, and the metrics had swipes, they had connections. There was a ton of metrics, and what really caught my eye wasn't the marketing of the metrics that, hey, we have more swipes than thumbs in this cohort, or it was just the visceral focus that the team that came up with the initial vision had every day, every week of understanding why people are using it, what they want to do with it, what they can do next with it, and ultimately that converted down into connections. When they wanted to go paid, it was like a big deal. They knew older folks would pay. Like they just had such great insight into it, and they made a bunch of mistakes. So don't get me wrong, but that was the thinking that drove a lot of the metrics that came out the other end.
Awesome. Let's take another question. No question.
Come on, you're easy. It's
Wow.
this easy.
Wow. Question. There's one over there and one over there. And one there now. Here a question, there a question, everywhere a question.
Hi there. I'm curious to get your take on early stage startups and the lean methodology and kind of launching products when you have limited resources for the sole reason of learning something about the market, in which case the product may lack excellence or may not be anywhere close to the 100%. It may be at like 40 or 50%, but you just want to learn something about the market. We've been getting so much advice to launch the product as early as possible and just iterate and make it better as we go along. And I'm curious to get your feedback on the stage at which you launch a product to the public and until when you should just test in a closed beta rounds. Thanks.
I'll jump in with some vanity stuff here. With a number of exceptions, so I don't want to go through the fine print here. If you're working on something and cannot get commercial traction in a software product in 100 days, you should really ask yourself why. It's either what you're working on isn't necessary, you couldn't build it. Like it's probably not more complicated than those two things. So to the release early, release often, I think that's true. But unless you're putting together drugs to cure cancer, like you should be in 100 days to be able to do something.
And by definition, you'll look better than Netflix did at launch.
Awesome. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So sorry, but the panelists might be around for a little bit afterwards, so you can try to track them down. But thank you very much to the panelists. It's a great chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.